Hi, everyone. I'm Don Davis. I'm your host for Supply Chain Secrets, and I'm introducing this episode. And had a lot of fun today. We were talking about the topic of NVOs with two subject matter experts on that. Konrad Torzewski, who's the Senior Director of Account Management here at NYSHEX for NVOs, and Ben Kauffman, who's the Senior Vice President of the Transpacific Trade at DSV. And after introductions, we start to talk a little bit about NVOs and how they've changed. So what does the modern NVO look like, and how has that changed over the course of the past 10 years? Then we start to talk about some of the key issues that are plaguing NVOs in the industry and what are some things that they're trying to do to resolve them. Then we talk about one of my favorite topics, the relationships with carriers and NVOs and the relationships with shippers and NVOs. And we talk about this idea of, can there be an NVO of choice? You've heard us talk on this podcast before about a shipper of choice, but is there such a thing as an NVO of choice? And what does that look like? So we had a lot of fun digging in on that. Then we talk about maybe the future and what areas there seems to be innovation, what areas are accelerating the fastest, and what kind of implications does that have? And then finally, we talk specifically about NYSHEX and how NYSHEX has been helping DSV manage some of their agreements, which has been really exciting for us. And I think you'll find that very interesting. And then at the end, everyone's favorite part of the show, our guests get to play podcaster and ask me some of the tough questions in the industry. So I thought it was a great show. I think you really like it. So give it a listen. And I think it's a good one. So thanks for listening, everybody.
You are now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast with Don Davis.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm Don Davis. I'm the Senior Vice President of NVO Experience here at NYSHEX and former executive of Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM. And today, we have another exciting episode of America's favorite podcast, Supply Chain Secrets. And today, we're talking about NVOs. And two of our guests are subject matter experts on NVOs, so really excited to dig in on this. First is Ben Kauffman. He is the Senior Vice President of the Transpacific Trade at DSV. And Konrad Torzewski. Konrad, I hope I said your last name right. There's a lot of letters there. But Konrad Torzewski, he is the Senior Director of Account Management for NVOs at NYSHEX. So, gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Don.
Thanks, Don.
So let's just start off. Ben, maybe you first can talk a little bit about your background and just talk about what you're doing at DSV and what you did prior to that.
Sure. So Ben Kauffman, I was a longtime Maersk guy. So I spent about 20 plus years on the carrier side with Maersk. Then I made the fortunate choice of moving over to Panalpina to the forwarder side. And I managed the Transpacific for Panalpina for about 5 years. Then after the acquisition from DSV, I stayed with DSV, and I've been about 2 years with DSV, also managing the Transpacific purely on ocean.
Okay, great. And Konrad, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yep, Konrad Torzewski, Don got it right. Senior Director of Account Management, NVOs at NYSHEX. Prior to NYSHEX, I spent 12 years at OOCL in various commercial roles, 6 years at Costco Shipping as head of NVO sales, and 3 years at a chassis leasing company, FlexiVan, as a national sales director for the NVOs. So now here at NYSHEX for over 9 months and excited to be here.
Well, thank you both for joining, and really excited to talk about NVOs. And I think with your backgrounds, it's going to be interesting. Plus, the benefit is I think we all have a bit of a carrier background, so we have that perspective too. But Ben, let's start with you. And when it comes to like NVOs, and if you think about the modern NVO today, how would you define an NVO today versus the NVO of, let's say, 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, I think when I first started in the NVO segment, 2013, that's not that long ago. I think there was a very firm strategy with our carriers and with our customers. And we would always set that strategy in Q1 of that year. And that strategy would be set in stone from May 1 all the way until the following year, both on the carrier side and on the customer side, whether that was a named account agreement or an FAK agreement. But it was pretty much set in stone for the 12 months, not a lot of firefighting. I think in today's NVO world, and we can thank COVID for this, it seems like everything's an emergency. I mean, our customers expect immediate attention. They want all kinds of different options. We cannot go to the customer base and tell them we do not have an option. So I think that we have literally, as a modern forwarder, we have overturned everything possible to help a customer move their cargo, whether it's air, ocean, truck, barge, whatever. We're just coming up with any kind of solution. Some of them are kind of crazy, but we'll do anything to help our customer move the cargo and with immediate attention. There is no waiting. I think that's how it's evolved. And obviously, digitalization is part of that as well. But I think it's really how we've become so tailored around giving solutions to our customers. It's very unique.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that, certainly the demands of customers have increased. People want visibility. They want to know where their stuff is. They want immediate solutions. And a lot of that's been driven by just the performance in the ocean trades, right? That things
Absolutely.
aren't moving as quickly as they should. So that's creating a bunch of problems. And Konrad, for you, when you think about that question and what you've seen and how NVOs have changed, I mean, Ben talked about, speed, solutions, digitization. Is there anything that is top of mind that isn't included in that list, or would you just double down and say, like, I see that this is the most important aspect?
I mean, I have to agree with Ben. The one thing I would add is the NVOs have become a lot more sophisticated than they were, up to 10 years ago. There's been a lot of investment in-house IT infrastructure as well. And I think to Ben's point, customers, if you look at NVOs 10, 15 years ago, there was a reputation that these guys just take the small shippers and consolidate them and bring the volumes on. Now, if you look at some of the largest BCOs in the market, every one of them has an NVO in their portfolio because you guys truly are the problem solvers of the industry. You don't just say, no, we can't do it, vessel's full. You go and explore the options. So yeah, to double down on Ben's point, it's an immediate response, and that's why the NVOs keep growing and becoming more sophisticated, because that's just the need in the market.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
Ben, for you, in thinking about this, I mean, we talked a little bit about how things have changed over time. And is there anything that you think is changing the most rapidly within that space? So, as far as like digitization, the type of solution, speed, but is there any segment that you say, well, this is the fastest changing part that I've seen across the past 10 years?
Well, I think and specifically for DSV, I think it's the carrier landscape. Our relationships with our carriers has changed dramatically, and I guess we'll talk about that a little bit. But certain relationships are strained, where other relationships have strengthened, and I think that's been the fastest change I've seen for us as DSV. Is the carrier relationship has been challenged. The other part of that would be that I think as DSV, and we're fortunate to be big enough that we're looking to any solution, looking at charters to move our customers' cargo. I think that so different types of solutions that are out of the box thinking, that's also a rapidly changing aspect for DSV. Shipper-owned containers. So really looking at any tailored solutions to a client's needs as quick as possible.
And how much do you think a lot of this change is driven from the pandemic? Because I think if you look at that time when the pandemic started in 2020, it in my mind changed everything almost, because you
100%
had
agree.
this period where like nothing was shipping, and blank sailings had kind of started before that, but I think during the pandemic it was like incredible the number of blanks. And then came this surge, this wave of cargo, and people shifted to buy goods as things were shut down and people are at home. But do you point to that as like the biggest change over the past 10 years that really drove a lot of what you're seeing today?
100%. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that importers were so desperate to get their hands on merchandise, they literally come to us or other forwarders or other carriers and push us very hard for any kind of solution. Price became secondary, which is, in our industry, that was not always the case. Price became secondary. Getting their hands on the merchandise and as soon as possible became the number one priority. And I believe that was completely driven by COVID. So, yes, I would agree with you.
Yeah, it's interesting how price has evolved. And I think the good news, I mean, none of us are on the carrier side anymore, but the good news is carriers are making money. Some might argue too much money, but carriers
Yeah.
are profitable now. I'm happy to see that, because for a long time, carriers were doing handstands to stay solvent, and it was a difficult time. So I think there's benefits for the industry, and having healthy balance sheet allows you to invest in different things. And we see different carriers doing different things, whether it's terminals, ships,
Yes.
NVOs, et cetera. But Konrad, from your perspective, I mean, you deal with a cross section of NVOs. Is there anything that stands out to you that the pandemic changed over the past 2 years?
Yeah, one of the biggest things was that the NVOs are now becoming a lot more selective who they partner with, and that's from both sides, whether it's from the ocean carrier or from the shippers that they sign agreements with, right? In the market where space is so tight and equipment is so scarce, having a reliable shipper becomes a big issue, almost like a trusted shipper. I mean, historically, on the ocean side, you would become, as a carrier, a preferred carrier or a carrier of choice for someone. Right now, NVOs have shippers of choice on their side. It's guys they can trust, guys that they have a limited amount of space available that know it will show up week in and week out. And so that's kind of been the biggest change through the pandemic that I've seen is it's the NVO market and community becoming a little bit more selective with the shippers that they sign with.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? I mean, if you have more demand than you have capacity, it's a good opportunity for you to start to change and say, maybe I want to partner with to a greater extent with somebody or take on new partnerships if you have some that are strained for this or that reason. I think that makes a ton of sense. But Ben, when you think about today's environment, today's market, there's a lot of challenges out there. We know that there are still blanks. We know that there's limitations on what carriers are offering. But what strikes you as like some of the key issues facing NVOs today?
Yeah, and there's a few of them. I think for us right now, we are struggling to meet some of our commitments with our customers and with the carriers. Certain customers right now, I think you talked a little bit about the carrier's profitability. I think that with the market softening a little bit, or the perception of the market softening a little bit, customers are coming to us expecting us to become their cost leader. They want us to try and save them money on transportation. And that's a challenge because I think while the market is softening, that cost savings is not necessarily out there yet. So living up to those commitments to our customers, but also delivering on reliability. I think the last reliability stats I saw were below 20% on time from the carriers, which is, in today's market, you're 80% late. That becomes very difficult for us as a service provider to deliver on those service commitments. With the carriers also living up to our allocations and our commitments, I think that's been a challenge. But then internally here at DSV, we are getting good staff. I think labor shortage or lack of labor is a major issue, not only for us from New Jersey, but across the country. Getting enough staff and getting enough labor is a real challenge for us.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I think the last stat I saw that there were 11 million open jobs in the U.S. And somehow my 19-year-old son can't find a job, but I think that's probably more his own selectivity, perhaps.
Tell him to call us, Don.
He might be looking for a CEO gig. He's not, doesn't quite understand 11 million jobs are not like C-suite, but anyway, he'll get there. But Konrad, over to you. Ben talks about the challenges today of like cost and reliability. Is there anything else that stands out to you that you hear from NVOs that you talk to?
I mean, the biggest thing is actually visibility, right? Because with all these service changes, with all the blank sailings, with these now long-term agreements becoming almost a norm in the industry, having visibility to blank sailings, to port emissions, to how you are performing as an NVO, and even more than that, how the shippers on your named account agreements are performing. That's becoming a major issue, right, in the market. So that's kind of the biggest hurdle that I've been hearing from the NVO community.
Yeah, I think visibility and, contract compliance is an issue. And Ben, when you think about carrier relationships and how that's changed, and you touched a little bit on it, but and I really want to spend some time talking about this topic because I'm super interested in it. But in terms of like how you think about managing your carrier relationships, what things are top of mind for you when you think about that?
Yeah, and I think you're right. I touched on in the beginning that as DSV, I think our relationships with our carriers is strained at best. I think right now in 2022, we are working very hard to strengthen some of the relationships with the carriers. Some of our relationships have unfortunately gone the wrong way. They are not great. But we've also strengthened some of those carrier relationships. And as DSV, especially managing the Transpacific, that we are now trying to support our top 4 or 5 carriers that supported us or helped us and our client base the last 24 months. So I think relationship in our industry and with our carriers is extremely important. And I think it's something that we work on religiously here at DSV.
And when it comes to that topic of strengthening a carrier relationship? What types of things, what type of activities would you say define you strengthening those relationships with your carrier partners?
Yeah, I think right now we're digging into the numbers a bit. We're making sure that we're delivering on our commitments, on our allocations. We're paying our carriers on time. That's very important. But I do believe that through our regular QBRs, through our quarterly business review meetings with our carriers, looking at the customer service, looking at EDI connections, looking at particular specifics of what we deliver to our carriers and what they deliver to us, and then trying to build on that. Again, this is a relationship business. Yes, we're both delivering service to our current customers, but our relationships with our carriers are extremely important. We work on that relationship at multiple levels within the carriers and strengthen that.
Yeah, I think that's important that you have different types of stakeholders involved, because I think, within ocean carriers, particularly, that different people have different realms of influence. So
Absolutely.
having those relationships with different stakeholders is important. And Konrad, I want to get your perspective on this idea of, can there be an NVO of choice? We talked in this podcast a couple of times about shippers of choice. And can there be an NVO of choice? Because my sense is that some carriers feel like, oh, NVOs, they're all transactional. Oh, they just want to beat me up. They're high cost to serve. And maybe it's unappealing for that reason that I don't want to deal with NVOs. But do you see an environment where there could be an NVO of choice?
There's no doubt in my mind, right? And I think an NVO of choice gets started simply the way Ben mentioned it, right? You deliver what you commit to. We all know the market sometimes goes ups and downs, right? It's cyclical. So when you commit to something, you deliver in the good times, you deliver in the bad times. Simple as that. The payment on time, the relationships at multi levels. Yeah. And I mean, trust gets built up over time. And, as I mentioned in the beginning, 10, 15 years ago, to your point, Don, the NVOs were thought of as transactional, just kind of consolidating smaller shippers. They're not anymore. They're not. And so from an ocean carrier's perspective, there's a reason that 45% of Transpacific eastbound cargo is moving on NVO paper. And it's because these guys are there providing a lot more than just the container service. And the trust goes a long way to build the NVO of choice relationship.
Yeah, Ben, and I would like to get your perspective on that question as well, because I think, this strange relationship between carriers and NVOs, and there's some that just, walk up to you and say like, okay, Ben, I need some business now. Give me something to
Yeah.
Shanghai or something. And there's others where, you have perhaps a longer term strategy and you say like, this is how we're going to grow with you in this particular trade. We're going to do this and that together. But can you talk a little bit about your experience in terms of your relationship with carriers on that piece? And do you believe it's possible to be an NVO of choice for an ocean carrier?
Yeah, and I do. And I think that every ocean carrier is different. And I think, at DSV, we look at every ocean carrier with a different strategy, a different approach. Some of the carriers are very transactional, and that's okay. Some of the carriers will look at us as, yes, we're a customer, but we're also potentially a competitor. And some of the carriers are very relationship driven. They're very loyal, so to speak, to certain customers or certain forwarders. So I think you need to learn or need to know which of the carriers you can work with and what their hot buttons are to make that a successful relationship. If you can do that and know every carrier is a little bit different, you can be quite successful. If you don't do that, it can be very difficult to work with the carriers. I think that can be a challenge. But I do also believe that you can be a forwarder of choice. And I really think maybe it's the Ohio in me, but being very transparent upfront, being flexible. But as Konrad mentioned, making sure you deliver what you sell, deliver what you committed. And if you can't, have that difficult conversation with the customer and then give a different solution. But I think proactive communication is huge. That's key.
Yeah. And it's nice to call out that we're all Midwesterners
Yeah.
on the podcast, because I'm originally from Chicago and Conrad's in Chicago. But I do think, my perspective on this is that I think it's a place where I think carriers should be looking at NVOs in terms of how they could develop those relationships. At CMA, I handled the NVO segment, and I always found it to be a very interesting space to work in, because NVOs go everywhere. They cover a lot of ground, and you could look at trade-offs because there's probably things that I want, there's probably things that you want. So how do we kind of work together and say you don't want it to feel like it's a one-way street. I mean, again, you can have those types of transactional relationships. And I think with some MVOs, it is all about cost. But I think there's a strategic component you can add in as a
Right.
carrier, and you can start to say like, hold on a second, if I want business to Oceania or I want export business, but I'm full on the import side, why don't I create some space? And no one's saying like discount it or give it away, but purely from a volume flow standpoint, I always felt like
Absolutely.
that made a ton of sense. And I don't feel like all carriers get that because, as you say, there's some feeling that NVOs can be a competitor, but I don't look at it that way. And I think that carriers
Right.
can actually benefit from partnering with NVOs because I don't see that carriers, at least at this stage, have the capacity. If I'm going to get rid of all the MVOs and I'm going to try and service all those customers, the increase in my cost to serve is going to be tremendous. And I may not have the ability to manage all these people coming to me. It's probably easier to have some of this work through an MVO and I just partner with them. But what do you think about that, Ben?
No, I think you're 100% right. I mean, there is definitely value of partnering with a forwarder, especially on the volume side. I mean, as DSV, we're one of the largest. We have around 2.5 million TEUs. When a carrier needs volume, we're able to deliver that volume. And as you correctly mentioned, on whatever trade that or whatever lane that carrier wants. And I like to always tell the carriers, if you want a certain amount of cargo per week, we're very good about making sure we can deliver that amount of cargo per week. And if you need more, then we can also be flexible with that. So I agree with you, but I think the volume for the ocean carrier, I think that is probably the key to working with a forwarder.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And so, Conrad, when we start to think about NVOs, I mean, there's really two sides of the NVO equation. There is the NVO to carrier piece, but there's also NVOs as a shipper piece and
Yeah.
NVOs acting as a carrier. That's what a non-NVO is for those that don't know. Non-vessel operating common carriers, NVOCC, that's where an NVO cuts their own bill of lading and acts as an ocean carrier. And what do you see on that side, Konrad? Because I think you have some exposure to that in terms of like how NVOs manage those relationships with their shippers and what kind of interactions have you seen there?
Well, honestly, I think the biggest thing is that the NVOs are looking at it as a whole piece of the pie business as opposed to from a carrier perspective, as you both mentioned. It's very kind of siloed and trade specific, right? So when a lot of NVOs go out for the business, they look at the whole thing, all the trade lanes, as opposed to I'm only responsible for one particular trade lane. That's the only one I can deal with. So that's also where the NVOs kind of get a leg up on the shippers. But to your point, Don, the biggest part of the relationship is the delivery of the cargo and the partnership with the shippers. The NVO essentially is a carrier. The NVO commits the space, the allocation, the pricing, the rates, and the customers expect that to be delivered on a weekly or monthly basis. And so, yeah, that's the biggest thing.
And Ben, when you think about this, I mean, it's got to be a pretty big challenge, right? Because your ability to deliver service is a function of the carrier and how they interact with you. So that I'm sure can be challenging at times. And so, how would you describe how you manage your relationship with your shippers, particularly in this environment?
Well, I think that Conrad hit on it correctly. That the ability to give end to end visibility, and again deliver on what you've committed to that particular customer. I think that's the key. But the end to end visibility part, that's where, in my opinion, the carriers are struggling or have challenges. And we, as a forwarder, we try and fill in those holes so we can tell the customer exactly when the cargo departs and when it is going to arrive. And customers today, as they have become more mature, the excuses of blank sailings or rollings or congestion, they'll accept that, but it's not an acceptable excuse for the cargo to be delayed. They expect us as a forwarder to find different solutions to help them deliver the cargo on time every time. So I agree that relationship with our shippers has changed to the point where they really expect you to deliver an end-to-end solution with visibility. And if you cannot, they will find somebody else that will.
But I think as an MVO, it has to be helpful that you have so many carrier relationships, right? So if I'm just dealing with a carrier directly, I'm stuck with their service. And if they blank or they're not executing, then I might not have another option. But
Yes.
as an MVO, if I go to you, it's like, well, this carrier isn't performing, but guess what? I have capacity over here. And I would think that's got to be something that's beneficial for shippers, that they have more of a variety of options than they might have if they just went to the carrier directly. But what are your thoughts on that?
100%. I think there's two comments there. Absolutely. If a carrier blanks, we will surely look for other options using any of the 8 or 9 or 10 carriers that we're using today on the Trans-Pacific. But we also make sure that we provide our customer base at least 2 alliances, 2 carrier options and 2 alliances. So if one carrier or one alliance blanks, we'll have another one as a backup. And I think that is the key that a direct carrier cannot offer a customer. If that carrier blanks, they literally have to wait till the following week to get space for that shipment. So you're 100% right. We use all 8 or 9 carriers on the Trans-Pacific, plus some of the niche carriers that have recently come into the market.
Yeah, I think that access to capacity is really key, because you talk about solutions, and we talked earlier in the show about, speed, and customers want to have some sort of option when it comes to their cargo. And NVO is pretty well equipped to do that, simply because they just have all this access to different types of capacity, different services. I mean, you mentioned chartering too. I mean, there's all these different things an NVO could do where, not all carriers could do that. Some carriers are doing different things, but as a whole, I think NVOs have probably a leg up there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the customers are expecting that flexibility in those different solutions from us. Especially with all the congestion that's happening in the United States and in Europe, the blank sailings, all these different variables in the market that are unpredictable. They expect us as DSV to find them different options, different carriers, different routings that can meet their needs. And if you don't offer that, they will look for other solutions. So we're very keen on trying again to give solutions to the clients that we service.
Yeah, I think solution selling is really important, particularly when you have to deal with so many of the issues that have happened over the past 2 years in shipping. And when you start to think about this, Konrad, and you think about the NVO space, we talked a lot how it's changing. Is there anything else that's top of mind when you think about how things are evolving? And if you start to look in the future for a second, do you see any particular space where NVOs are starting to evolve, or they're starting to focus on, as opposed to maybe what they were doing 5 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, the NVO as the carrier model, I think, is it's already there, but it's not talked about that much, right? I think, to Ben's point earlier, in the last few years, the NVOs have gained a lot of credibility in the marketplace, more than a few years. But so now more and more shippers are considering adding an NVO to their portfolio, where 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. So I think that the important part from the NVO perspective is having to, again, go into visibility, but being able to see which one of your shippers is moving with which carrier and how they're moving, and being able to identify kind of these shortfalls or shippers that are already falling behind a little bit. Because to Ben's point, if a shipper comes to you and has an issue for the blank sailing, you need to be able to look in and see exactly where you can put that cargo, and knowing who's not performing or might be able to give you the option to switch to, that to another shipper that needs the help. So I think the biggest thing is, in the future, looking forward, is more and more shippers will be looking at the NVOs as the carrier of choice for them that haven't done so in the past.
Yeah. And Ben, when you think about that question of like innovation, evolution of NVOs, is there anything that's top of mind for you when you think about, if you look into the future? And I always put a disclaimer, like me personally, terrible at making predictions. Okay. So it's a very hard thing to do. But from your perspective, is there anything that also resonates with you when you start to think about, I see things accelerating and evolving in this particular space?
I do. And I think that, and I'm not saying that we're there yet, but I think using technology to anticipate challenges in supply chain. So customers are coming to us and saying, what is going to happen in Q1 of 2023? Where do you expect congestion? What's the market going to look like? So using technology to try and predict or manage, I should say exception management, managing the cargo that's going to be delayed or not meet the NDC dates, looking for different options and predicting where there's going to be challenges, and then working around those challenges to make sure you give them the highest on-time reliability that you can give them. But I think using technology is going to be the key. As DSV, we have My DSV Plus that does exception management, that tries to forecast where there will be delays, where there'll be challenges, looks at carriers' reliability, tries to use carriers that have the high reliability on-time performance. So But I think using that technology is going to be the future. I think you have to. You can't do it manually.
Yeah, hopefully we're getting out of the stage of spreadsheets and slinging
I
emails
hope so.
around, although sometimes I feel like we're far away from that. But on my last show, I talked to an expert on the Internet of Things, and he gave me a lot of hope that, there's technology coming. But when you think about technology, and I think for DSV, NYSHEX plays a role in terms of delivering technology and visibility there. Can you talk a little bit about your experience interacting with NYSHEX and what that's been like for you?
I think, yeah. I mean, NYSHEX for us as DSV, and I should say as a company, has been a very positive experience. Number one, I think you have great people. I really do. NYSHEX has hired some very smart people, some forward-thinking people, and I think people is the key in our industry. But then working with NYSHEX through some of our contract, helping us manage customers, giving us different solutions, helping us hold carriers and customers accountable in some of those commitments, I think has been a very attractive asset or very attractive tool at DSV. And we hope that you continue to grow and have a lot of success.
Well, we do too.
Yeah.
So far it's been great. I mean, and if I could just talk for a second about my experience here, I've been here almost 2 years now, which sounds like weird to even
Yeah.
say because the company's not even that old. But it's been a tremendous journey, and to see the how we've evolved and how we're helping shippers, carriers, and MVOs is a lot of fun, a lot of work. Don't get me wrong; it's not just like fun and games here, but there's a lot of effort that we have to go through to make sure everything works. And Konrad, from your perspective, when you think about the type of services that we're providing MVOs, when MVOs act as a shipper and a carrier, I mean, you're like, this is your life. Like, you're like knee deep in this. And can you talk a little bit about that experience and the type of value that's being created through what we're providing?
Yeah, honestly, the biggest part from what we've seen is just the visibility, the almost instant visibility into the customer performance, right? Not just the ocean agreement, but also the customer agreement. The exception management has been a lifesaver, especially in these long-term agreements when there are two-way committed penalties. Being able to say, okay, well, here's a situation for this particular service or point pair, here's what happened, being able to justify. And exception management, to Ben's point, from our perspective, exception management is not necessarily a delay, but it's when something doesn't perform when a specific lane is agreed to. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? And that performance and exception management has been key simply because this sometimes takes a few months before it comes up. So if we can monitor it at the time it happens, it gets resolved rather quickly versus going through, to your point from earlier, Don, 100 emails from 3 months ago trying to identify what happened with one particular shipment. But just having that visibility to the exceptions, to every one of the shippers on that agreement, and then having the conversations with the local branches for DSV. Ben, you gave us a great compliment. I mean, DSV also hires a lot of fantastic people that are incredible to work with and that actually really care about your customers. And so we get calls, we get emails working with your teams on the performance to make sure it goes the way you guys committed to your customers. So there's a lot of things, but it goes both ways from the DSV perspective.
Yeah. I can tell you, just to add to that, we have found in this business, it's a challenging business to be in, and collaboration is the key. You have to work multiple partners, whether that's a carrier or through NYSHEX or truckers, whoever. It's all about collaboration to deliver to our mutual clients. And I think that's the key to success.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think one of the things, Comrade, you touched on visibility, and one of the things that we're working on is NYSHEX that I'm really excited about because it just plagued me my whole shipping life,
Yeah.
which is you would get these reports and they would say, okay, Konrad was supposed to do 100 TEUs a week, but I see he did 60, 80, 40. I'm going to cut his allocation. I'm going to reduce what he's getting. And you're like, wait a minute. The only reason why I delivered 60 is because you didn't have equipment. There was a blank sailing. And so, and
Correct.
at that point, like nobody cares. It feels like nobody's listening. They're like, too bad. I just go with the number. And one of the things we're innovating on is this real versus nominal capacity and performance because it's important. I mean, it's something we do as part of managing like enforceable contracts and different types of contracts is that we have the technology and data to provide that visibility. But what's so important is you're getting to a point where you can see the real performance. So if there's some sort of what we call excuses, we have these valid excuses, whether it's a blank sailing or shutdown for COVID or a cyber attack, these are things that aren't counted in the performance. But to get to a place where you can see the real performance and say, oh, my allocation shouldn't really be 100, it should have been 60 because of this or that reason. I think going forward in an industry where you can talk more realistically about the performance, and we can all talk about when we say this is what we did in May, we can look at it the same way versus, again, feeling like you're penalized because your performance shows one thing. That's not really what I tried to do, but you're stuck with this number that is just hard to unpeel for everyone because the technology isn't there to support that.
100%. And just to add to that, I mean, I think it's also having the numbers. I think sharing numbers, their actual performance with our clients or with our carriers. Here's your actual performance with real numbers instead of talking in generalities is so important. And sometimes we don't have the numbers or the customer doesn't have the exact numbers. So, NYSHEX provides those exact numbers to us, which is that's very important.
Yeah, and it feels pretty good over here because this is all we do, so we should be pretty good
Yeah.
at it. And
Yeah.
as you say, we got a lot of smart people here, so that's been a fun journey. Okay, so we're at the point of the show where we're really at the end, but before you go, it's your opportunity to play podcaster. So I've been peppering you both with questions here at the end of the show. I usually let the guests for our listeners ask me a question. So is there anything top of mind? Either one of you, fire away anything you want to ask the host of Supply Chain Secrets.
Konrad?
Well, Mr. Davis, you've been on the carrier side for quite some time in your career. What was the biggest surprise when you left the carrier side and joined a tech startup?
Wow. I think when I was at a carrier, and I think there were different degrees of this, but it was hard to innovate because, you had things that were pretty well set up and structured. So it almost felt like, you're trying to turn around an aircraft carrier to move in a different direction. It was just very difficult to do. And at a startup, there's things that just don't even exist yet. And people say to you, hey, Don, that's a pretty good idea. Go do it. And you're like, what do you mean? Like, oh, yeah, go do it. It doesn't exist yet. And you really are creating things from scratch. You can implement a lot of different ideas, it's crazy to think about that. You go from one extreme where it's like you want to change one part of something that you do and you can't really change it. But here at a startup, it's like, hey, that's a great idea. Let's create a project. Let's put some resources behind it, and you start doing it. And you're like, oh my God. And it's been really fun though to see things that didn't exist before that we've been able to do. So that journey has been incredible. But you would think, hey, we're a startup, we're a smaller company, we should be more nimble and agile to do those things than companies with like 13, 15, 100,000 employees. It's much harder to bring about change. So it's fun to be part of that change.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. I can remember my first week. We have a weekly product call, and I just asked one question my first week, and next week product presented a solution. It was already done. So the speed to market was incredible to me, just from a question. We have the team that just built it from a question. It's incredible.
Ben, over to you. Any questions, anything that's top of mind that you want to ask the host of Supply Chain Secrets?
Well, I think that I'm going to ask you the impossible question. I think that, and that's a question I get asked all the time from our client base and from our carriers is where's the light at the end of the tunnel? When does congestion become alleviated? What does the new norm look like in 2023 or is it 2024? But what is your crystal ball talking to your industry sources? What is it telling you the next 12 months look like?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's been good news for a while. I think the one thing that seems to be true is that capacity is more readily available. So there isn't the same demand on capacity, but you have all these other issues, whether it's, empty container returns or congestion in the port or lack of availability of truckers or chassis. And I don't really see us getting out of that anytime soon, just because there's still all this volume coming in. And it's a problem that needs to be solved because we all know that there's this capacity injection starting to come into the trades over the next year and a half. Well, what does more capacity mean? Well, it means more volume. And it's almost like, where is this going to go? Because there isn't the ability for rails to handle some of this volume or truck capacity to handle it. So I think it's going to still be a tough situation. And I think there's some people who say I might feel better because I see that okay, there isn't these $20,000 rates anymore. It's come down to a more realistic level, still extremely profitable, but maybe more realistic level. But that's one piece. I think there are other parts of the supply chain where there's still a lot of issues. And I would say 12 months, I would expect more of the same. And I think the other thing is, like, we haven't had a shock in a while, that we had the Ever Given, we had the pandemic, and you had the Shanghai shutdown, and there hasn't been that type of thing in a while. So I think, there's a recency bias that you think like, oh, we haven't had that for a while, so everything's normal. And I don't think you can plan on that, because I think we're one shock away from things just going haywire again.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that statement.
All right, great. Well, Ben, Konrad, thanks for coming on the show. Been a lot of fun for me. And for our listeners, don't forget, rate us, review us wherever you find our podcasts, give us some feedback. We'd love to hear from you. So thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.